Good evening. I'm Stuart Dorsey, and as president of Texas Lutheran University, it is my honor to welcome you to tonight's Brown Distinguished Lecture, presenting renowned author and political commentator Cokie Roberts. Ms. Roberts' appearance is made possible by TLU's Jesse S. and Jack Harold Upton Brown Endowment Fund. Jesse and Jack Brown's generosity has created a distinguished lecture program that has brought to TLU an impressive series of national figures over the years. And Cokie Roberts furthers that good tradition this evening. Ms. Roberts has long been one of the most respected observers of the Washington political scene. Her broadcasting career includes co-anchoring the weekly ABC interview program This Week for 7 years, and she now delivers commentary for ABC News and National Public Radio. Her honors are too numerous to mention here, but include more than 20 honorary degrees, 3 Emmys, induction into the Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and designation as one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting. In 2008, the Library of Congress named her a living legend, one of very few Americans to have attained that honor. Ms. Roberts, along with her husband Steve Roberts, writes a weekly national syndicated newspaper column. It's also published in our own Seguin Gazette. The Roberts are also contributing editors to USA Weekend magazine, and together they wrote From This Day Forward, an account of their more than 40-year marriage and other notable marriages in American history. Cokie Roberts also is the author of the #1 bestseller, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, which joined her earlier bestsellers, Founding Mothers and Ladies of Liberty. Her latest book is Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington, 1848 to 1868, and I believe she'll be available after tonight's lecture to sign those books out in the lobby. Ms. Roberts has lamented the disappearance of bipartisan leadership and courage, and she ought to know. Her father was Hale Boggs, House Majority Whip and Majority Leader until his untimely death in 1972. Hale Boggs knew how to get a deal done and worked at a time when not only was doing a package possible, but expected, and politicians were actually admired for that. I was privileged to witness that same skill and courage in Senator Bob Dole when I was staff economist for the Senate Finance Committee that he chaired in the early 1980s. As the years have gone by and the culture on Capitol Hill has changed, I've come to realize what a rare and not likely to be seen again privilege that was. Clearly, it's a different world from the days of Hale Boggs and Bob Dole, of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. Cokie Roberts has witnessed that change close up, and I very much look forward to her thoughts tonight. Please give a warm Texas Lutheran welcome to Cokie Roberts.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you for that lovely welcome. I am thrilled to be back in Seguin. Yeah. I was almost here for an undetermined period of time as a resident of the taxpayer-funded facilities near the courthouse. So I know the pecan well. It was about 40, let's see, my son is 48, so it was 47 years ago. And I was 24 years old, my Steve was 25. We were driving from New York, where we lived, to Los Angeles, where we were moving. And we drove through Seguin. I apparently was driving a little faster than I should have been in our 1964 Ford Falcon, and which both sets of parents were just horrified that we were driving across the country. And so I got hauled in, and it was really, it wasn't just the cop stopping me. We got hauled into the courthouse, and I was very confused. I didn't know what to do, because my parents and I, and you've just heard from President Dorsey, that my father was in Congress for many years, followed by my mother in Congress for 9 terms. And we used to drive back and forth from New Orleans to Washington a couple of times a year. And my father got pulled over all the time. And there were rackets in these little towns. You know, it was the main source of income. And but he was speeding. And so one time, right after my brother got his license when he was, 15, which is what it was, and it probably is here still. And we were driving through Mississippi. He got stopped, and we got pulled into the Justice of the Peace, or whatever he was. His courtroom was in a garage behind his house, and he says to my brother, "Well, son, you guilty or not guilty?" And Tommy says, "Well, guilty, I guess." And so we get back in the car, and my mother says, "Don't ever do that. You never plead guilty." So now I'm in Seguin, and I don't know what to do. If I don't plead guilty, maybe they're going to keep me here, and I've got a 2-month-old, and also they're already keeping us here for a good long time. We were here a long time that day. And finally, the baby just was howling so loudly that it worked. And the fact that we were pinching him had nothing to do with it. And finally, we do meet the judge, and she says, "Are you guilty or not guilty?" And I said, "Well, I need to know what it would mean if I said I was guilty. I want to have a conversation about this." And she says, "Well, do you have oversized tires or anything?" And I said, "No." She said, "You're guilty." So that solved it. I didn't have to plead, and so I paid the fine and left Seguin. And this is the first time I've been back. And it's lovely. It is great to be on this beautiful campus. And I was really excited when I discovered that the Bulldogs were going to the Final Four. Wrong Bulldogs. You're not Gonzaga. But actually, I did learn that you've actually done, from my perspective, things that count for more. Because they require more than just athletic. I understand athletic prowess counts for a lot, but for the second year in a row, the athletes here have won the Change for the Better competition to collect change from fans and parents and students and everyone at the one weekend basketball game and give it to a nonprofit. Now that's something that really makes a difference, and that's something to be very proud of. And it's part of what this university does in terms of service. And that is really something to be very proud of. And I was so impressed when I started reading about it, because the commitment is both theoretical. In 2012, 77% of seniors, 77%, you don't get that on anything anymore, said that you should take a civically engaged class to apply whatever discipline you're learning in the community. And 66% said they actually did engage in community service. That's huge, and that's a wonderful thing that this university should be incredibly proud of. And it includes food for low-income families near the campus, and something that I think is just so impressive, something that the business students have put together, connects again, of providing transportation for elderly and low-income people, which is a huge, huge thing, because it's not easy to walk around Seguin from the outskirts. And so to have transportation is terribly important. So I'm very impressed with everything that I have been reading about the school. And, I obviously went on the websites because girls do homework. And there I did learn that President Dorsey had been chief economist for Bob Dole. And I couldn't agree with him more that we don't see the likes of Bob Dole in Washington anymore. Not only is it a place that he brought tremendous leadership to, and I'm happy to say he's still with us, but he's not in the Capitol bringing that leadership to much people who really could use it. But he also brought wonderful humor to everything that he engaged in. He had a whole series of Strom Thurmond jokes that he would just tell one after another because, you know, Thurmond served in the Senate till he was 100. And we had thought that had been true several years before, but he, and Doe would say, you know, Thurmond had been an intern in the Washington administration, but Strom was very chipper for a 100-year-old, and Doe would say, I just watch him, you know, he eats a banana, I eat a banana, you know. But actually, the best Strom joke is one that Strom himself used to love to tell, and it's a true story. Now, you have to keep in mind, sort of every 22 years, Strom would marry a 22-year-old. And when my daughter was 22, I locked her up. So all of his children were younger than mine. And so at one point, he took them to a horse farm that was run by the National Park Service. And he got there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the arm of the park had come down, closing it. And he says to the ranger, why, that's just terrible. You can't close the park. I am the president pro tempore of the United States Senate. And the ranger said, we're closed. And he said, but I am the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And the ranger said, closed. And then Strom went back over his resume of the last 40 years or whatever, and it did not succeed in opening the park. And finally, he said, well, this is terrible. I brought my little children all this way, and they're just going to be so disappointed if they can't go in. And the ranger looks in the car, and he says, Senator, those are your children? And Strom says, why, yes. And the ranger says, come right in. So in they go, around they go, they see the horses, they have a very nice time. And then the tour is over, and the senator says to the ranger, why, this has been so nice, and you've been so gracious, and I'm so grateful. But I'm puzzled. Tell me, you know, I told you all these things about myself, and you didn't open the park, and it was only when I told you the children would be disappointed that you did? Is it that you just loved little children so much that you wanted them to see the horses? And the ranger said, no, Senator, I wanted the horses to see you. So you can see why it was his favorite story. But I have to tell you, these days we're missing Strom. We're missing all of them who used to be able to get things done. We are living in a capital in a country that is deeply divided, often hostile, where people can't even agree on the same facts, much less the same policies. And I am asked all the time, is this the worst it's ever been? I'm somewhat offended by this question because I feel like they think I've been there covering it since then. And the answer to that is no, they are not shooting each other. That's a plus, metal detectors, good. And it is true that they used to shoot each other all the time. I mean, Burr Hamilton was just the most famous of the duels, but it happened all the time. The term of art was to call each other out. They would call each other out on the floor of Congress and then go out to Bladensburg, right outside of Washington, where there was a dueling ground, and then they would shoot each other over political speech. And at least that's not happening. And by the way, Burr Hamilton, think about it. Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States when he murdered his political enemy over political speech. Now, one of our most recent vice presidents had a problem with a gun, but I don't think that was what it was. So it's not the worst that we've ever seen. The worst, actually, was the period in the lead up to the Civil War. And that was a terrible time when people could not come together. President Dorsey was kind enough to mention my most recent book about the Civil War. I never wanted to write about the Civil War. I hate the Civil War. My publisher insisted that I write about the Civil War and came up with a book, but I hate it for a variety of reasons. First of all of my ancestors fought on the wrong side, but the losing side. But it's also true that as someone who loves this country and believes in its institutions, it was such an incredible failure of politics. The idea that we could not get to emancipation without killing 500,000 Americans is a horrible, horrible failure. And that is the worst it's ever been. But thank God we don't have an issue like slavery in front of us. And there can be no issue like slavery. It is unique. But thank God we don't have something that is a huge moral issue that is tearing us apart. Because right now, I do not think we are equipped to be dealing with it. We are dealing in a time where people really cannot come together and get something done. And as President Dorsey said, it was not always this way. I had the incredible honor a couple of years ago of being asked to be one of the eulogists at Betty Ford's funeral. And I would have been terrified, frankly, about doing that, except Mrs. Ford had told me exactly what she wanted me to say, which made it considerably easier. And she had been there when I had had my last interview with President Ford. And he said to me, "Cokie, I just don't understand what's going on in Washington today." And that was before it got anywhere near as bad as it is now. And he said, when I was minority leader of the House and your dad was majority leader, we would get in a cab together, which was an exaggeration. They had drivers, but it was a good story. And we would go downtown to some place like the Press Club, and we would say, "All right, what are we going to argue about?" And he said, "Look, it was a real debate. We genuinely disagreed about means to an end. And it was partisan, for heaven's sakes. We were the leaders of our parties in the House of Representatives." But then we would get back in the cab and go back to the Hill and be best friends. And that's absolutely true. That is the way it was. And there is nothing that even vaguely resembles that today. People within the same party don't speak to each other, especially right now, but certainly not across the aisle. So it is a very troubling time. What happened? I ask that question all the time, too. Well, there are a couple of things. There are lots of things. One is that I've come to believe, as someone who reads a lot of American history and writes it, is that period that President Ford and my father were in was aberrant. It was the most conducive time towards people coming together because of World War II. They had all been at war together. The last of our World War II veterans left in the last Congress. One was Sam Hall from Texas, the other John Dingell. So the Congress was filled with World War II vets. There were two enormous classes, a huge Republican class of 1946, a huge Democratic class of 1948. And they were very self-conscious veterans. They ran as the men who went, not the men who sent. 16 million Americans had been in uniform, and the whole country had gone to war. Everybody was engaged in the endeavor. Everybody had rationing. Everybody was working on the war effort. So it was a time of everyone coming together. And these members of Congress had literally been in foxholes together. And so they knew who the enemy was. It wasn't the guy across the aisle, it was the dictator across the sea. And the Cold War then perpetuated that. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't tremendous moments of partisanship in there and nastiness. Joe McCarthy was in this period of time. But by and large, they could come together with a common purpose and get things done because they believed that everyone there was there to serve the country. And no one questioned the other's motives. They just questioned whether their policies were right, whether they were wrong-headed, but not whether they were wrong-spirited. And that was a special time. But I do think that was almost unique. Since then, a lot of other things have happened. One is that the families don't come to Washington anymore. So that, the Fords and the Boggses knew each other. And we all saw each other at school and at church and in picnics and the cleaners and, just normal life. PTA, the moms, and it was the moms, at the PTA meetings, all of that. So everybody saw each other, and nobody could demonize you. One of my best friends growing up was Libby Miller. She's still a good friend. Her father, Bill Miller, was very conservative Republican from upstate New York, who became chairman of the Republican National Committee and Barry Goldwater's running mate in 1964. My father was a liberal Democrat from the South. This is an oddity here, the liberal Democrat from the South and the conservative Republican from New York, but hey. We went to school together. I was at her house all the time. She was at my house all the time. It's hard to demonize someone whose kid is playing Clue in your basement. And that was the case for many, many people. So that's one of the things that changed. Families no longer come to Washington. The idea of bringing your family to Washington is politically considered deleterious, that you go there and you go native. And Washington is portrayed as some sort of Sodom on the Potomac. I have looked for it and never found it, but that is, that's the portrayal. And some of them live in their offices, which is nigh on disgusting, really. And really. And also, by the way, I don't want to pay their rent. I'm a taxpayer. But that's the atmosphere. So that there's no sense of just normalcy. Then you have this permanent campaign. The campaign never stops. And so everybody's always running. And outside groups are always influencing it. So that even if you want to have a conversation where you think that you can get to some place where it makes sense to give a little here, get a little there, you get punished by some organization that's doing a scorecard and saying that they are going to get you if you don't vote 100% the way that they think that you should. There's the media, and it's all of us. Those of us in the mainstream media are guilty of giving our microphones to the loudest shouters, but that's the least of it. The fact is we now have whole outlets that are just one point of view or the other, so everybody lives in these echo chambers where they're just hearing what they already think and hearing it reinforced, whether it's on the left or right, or whether it's in the blogosphere, or on television or on talk radio, or worst of all, in social media, where people seem to take joy. This I truly don't understand. I don't understand what the human nature factor is here, where people seem to take great glee in saying mean and ugly and horrible things on Twitter. And why? What joy do you get out of that? I don't know. But it affects the body politic. And so all of that has affected it. And then there is, and you've heard a lot about this, but there's a reason to hear a lot about this, because it's true, the drawing of district lines. And the way district lines are drawn now, you can really only get in trouble in a primary, because the districts are drawn to be so safe for either party that if you don't, again, toe the strict ideological line on the left for the Democrats, on the right for the Republicans, you're likely to have someone challenge you in a primary where the true believers, very few people vote to begin with, and those who do are true believers on both sides. And again, it puts you in a position where you can't have a conversation that is not straight down the line. I had a very interesting experience the last year of President Bush's term, where I got this phone call out of the blue from Dana Perino, the White House press secretary, and I was surprised. I don't cover the White House. I didn't know her. I just seen her on TV. And she said, Cokie, the president wants to know if you would like to ride with him in the limousine out to Andrews Air Force Base when he goes to meet the Pope. And I said, okay. I'll see if I can clear the schedule. And so I did get in the car. It was totally cool. It was the president, Mrs. Bush, and Jenna. And he wanted to talk to me about why he was breaking precedent to go greet the Pope at Andrews rather than have the Pope come to the White House, which is the normal situation. I was chosen for this because I speak Pope. After my mother retired from Congress in 1990, she didn't run again in 90, she retired for a few years and discovered, of course, that was very hard work. And so she accepted the job at age 81 in 1997, a new job in a new country as the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, which was great. You know, we in the family were very excited. You know, she was a great capstone to a career in public service where she could serve her country and her church. We'd get to go to Rome all the time, and that would be cool. And then what happened in this country happened, and my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Now, think of it. It was the toughest job in the diplomatic service. If anybody could do it, Mama could. Now, President Clinton always says, but Cokie, the Pope liked me. And I'm sure that's true. But it was an interesting experience. But it got me this ride in the car. And so as we're talking, it's a quick ride when you're in a motorcade with the president, but he was telling me that he was a great believer in the Pope's moral authority, and that's why he was going to honor him. And that got us to talking about the role of the church in America, and it was right after President Bush's immigration bill had gone down, and the Catholic bishops have been great supporters of that bill. And so we were talking about that, and he said, and I'm quoting here, he said, Cokie, I tried and tried and tried to get my party to do the right thing on immigration, but I couldn't because of the way district lines are drawn, because people were too afraid of being challenged in a primary. And so, you know, we've always had gerrymandering. It's named after one of the founding fathers. The difference now is computers. So now you can draw a district so that you know every single voter in it. And, you know, you can get every one-eyed veteran who's never voted Republican and put them on that district, and the Democrat will win. And that's the way they're drawn these days. And so that makes it very, very difficult to have a competitive election and to have people who feel a need to be engaged in the business of legislation. Added to that, we've had this kind of interesting sociological phenomenon where people have started to move to areas where there are other like-minded people. It's called the Great Sort. And so, for instance, right now in this Congress, when Donald Trump talks about working with Democrats, I can't find who he's talking about, because there are only 12 Democrats, 12 out of 435 in the House of Representatives whose districts went for Donald Trump. And there are only 23 Republicans whose districts went for Hillary Clinton. So what you've got is a country that is really blue and red. And that, again, makes it very hard to find the people in the middle who get things done. So those two numbers I just gave, that's a total of 35 in the House of Representatives, of districts that they went one way for president, one way for the House. In 2004, there were 59. In 2000, there were 86. In 1996, there were 110. It's a quarter of the House of Representatives. That's a group of people you can make legislation with. But now you have these very, very blue, very, very red. Where do you go from there? The National Journal has done this measure for years of looking at the voting records of people. The conceit they take is to look at the voting records of people who vote between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. And well into the 1990s, it was more than half of the House of Representatives and more than a third of the Senate. It is now 0 in the Senate, and one lonely soul in the House of Representatives, Walter Jones, a Republican whose father was a Democrat, and who yesterday became the only Republican to say that Nunes should step down as head of the Russian investigation. So it is a very hard thing to see how you get from this situation to governing. Because, as I said before, not only do people disagree about policy, but they do disagree about facts. Today, CBS came out with a poll that's just typical, explaining where we are with this. The question was asked, how likely is it that the Trump campaign had an improper communication with agents of the Russian government? Republicans, 75%, not very likely or not at all likely. Democrats, somewhat or very, 85%, somewhat or very likely. No, they don't agree on the facts. No. Did Russians interfere in the election, period, regardless of Trump or not? Did Russians interfere? Republicans, 64% no. Democrats, 67% yes. Now, this is despite the fact that the intelligence agencies have said that the Russians interfered. And so, an independent split, by the way. Was Trump Tower wiretapped? 74% of Republicans, yes. 74% of Democrats, no. Again, the FBI says didn't happen. Wasn't a question. But if it doesn't fit with the political view, then the facts are ignored or believed to be not facts and fake news. Now, I must say that it's somewhat amusing because most of my life it's the Democrats who were seen as being too friendly to the Russians and the Republicans who were more suspicious of the Russians, and Democrats who wouldn't believe the FBI, and the Republicans who would. But that's all seems to be turned around because politically that works for the two parties right now. And beyond those anomalies, there is the question of trust. If you only believe the partisan outlets you already agree with, where does that leave just truth and facts? And where does that leave a free press? You know, we spend a lot of time in this country and money in organizations that are designed to promote democracy around the world. And one of the things we preach and that we actually help establish is a free press around the world, and talk about how you can't have civic engagement without that. And suddenly it's under attack in this country. So it's a troubling time to see these kinds of divisions. And they're not just on the basis of partisanship, but also we're divided by race, by sex, by age, and by education. And so what you see, and we saw again in 2016, is young people, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and women voting Democratic. Whites and older voters and men voting Republican. And though we spent a lot of time leading up to the election talking about how the white vote had been going down from the 89% it was when Ronald Reagan was elected, and got, by the way, the same percentage of the white vote that Donald Trump did, the fact is that, yes, it has gone down, but it's still 71% of the vote. And that is where you saw the results of this election. Now, it shrinks in every election, as you see here in Texas, and despite the big Republican wins, and they're huge, because it's not just at the Congress, the federal level, but it's all over the country. The Democratic Party has basically not tended to its knitting and not talked to voters in a way that voters feel connected to, and lost 900 legislative seats in the course of the Obama presidency. But it's still true that if you look at the demographics, if the Republicans don't capture the Hispanic vote and young people, in the long term, that's a problem. And that's why things like the wall and climate change positions and all of that can be problematic for the Republican Party. Not to mention what happens when the Texas legislature meets, which they are doing. But it is true right now, with the control of the Congress and the White House, that it is an opportunity for Republicans to push through changes on things like climate change or privacy rules or worker safety rules or build a wall. And what tends to happen, and it happened with Democrats after Bill Clinton was elected, it happened after Barack Obama was elected. When you have the presidency and the Congress all in one party hands, that party tends to overreach, and the voters then respond in the next election. What we're finding right now is that the voters are already responding, and that's what we saw with health care, because it actually directly affects people. And what members of Congress found was that they were suddenly being really beat up by the American Cancer Society, the American Diabetes Association, Parkinson's. These are not people you want to have mad at you. It doesn't make you feel good. And to have people with cancer saying, don't take away my medicine. And so the bill fell apart. And there was nobody who could put it together. Paul Ryan says that the party is having growing pains, not having really learned to govern. Barney Frank, the openly gay former member of Congress and something of a humorist, says, asking Republicans to govern is like asking me to judge Miss America. Your heart's just not in it. And, but they're trying. And yesterday, the Freedom Caucus was called in by the other members and told to explain themselves for being such obstructionists, but I actually think they were pretty smart. The people I feel sorry for are the Republicans who said they were for this bill that then didn't go anywhere and still will get heat in the coming election because the Democrats can still make ads saying he was ready to vote to cut your cancer medicine. But the Freedom Caucus members came out of that meeting and said, we're not going to compromise. We didn't come here to play with the Republican leadership. And so, again, where do you go from there? Who can put it together? Gets us back to Bob Dole, who was a master of that. He really was the consummate legislator. But there's nobody like that anymore. And so when I look around and try to sort of see how do you look for glimmers of hope, at the elected official level, my answer is that I do see the glimmers among the women. And I can't tell you how much we miss Kay Hutchison. She was a truly good member of the Senate. And she worked across party lines all the time, as most of the women in the Senate do. The last time that we had a government shutdown, it was a Democratic woman and a Republican woman in the Senate who finally got the government open, understanding that it affected real people. And their basic reaction was, oh, for God's sake. And, we need a lot more of that. But also, the other glimmer of hope, I think, is in the spate of activism that we're seeing now. I think that's great. We have had way too long, on both sides, a quiescent period, where we really haven't seen voices raised saying, we can do something, we can fix this. Because voters really can fix it, but they have to be ready to do it. I noticed on the school website that I was being promoted as part of Women's History Month. I am female, and wore a skirt. But I'm thrilled to be that because I do write women's history. And one of the things that I say to kids right now, because I have a kids' book of Ladies of Liberty out, which is about the period of the early republic, and I talk to little children about this. The women of that period had no rights whatsoever. They had no legal rights. They couldn't own property if they were married. The clothes on their body, the earrings on their ears belonged to their husbands. They certainly had no political rights. But they looked around at this great country and saw it with the tremendous excitement that was here as immigrants came in from Europe and the country moved west and the sense of possibility was everywhere. But there were some people who didn't make it, with people falling through the cracks, particularly widows and children. And so, without any official power, they went about the business of creating a social safety net. And they did it in city after city, in religion after religion. They got out of their private sphere, as it was called, went to the state legislatures, lobbied, got money, went out into the public, raised more money, bought property. They got a single woman that was always a treasuress, so she could buy property and the husband couldn't seize the assets, and created institutions which are still going 200 years later. Isabella Graham in New York started with Eliza Hamilton, now famous on Broadway. I hate Alexander, started an orphanage in New York that is still serving, it's not an orphanage anymore, but it is still serving the needy children of New York City. Graham Windham. In Washington, Dolly Madison, after the British invasion in 1814, worked with the women in Washington to establish an orphanage, still serving the children of Washington 200 years later. And that's true all over the country. So if they could do it then with no rights, establish these essential and lasting institutions, we can do it now. And the kids, the young people, the fine, mature young people at this institution are the perfect people to do it. With the wonderful Lutheran tradition focused on service, as I said earlier. It is just the place to be leading that movement to bring voice to those who need to have their voices heard and to tell the politicians that your voice matters. Yesterday, students from here braved the legislature to lobby for tuition equalization grants. It's a great experience to have, but it's also a very high form of service, public service. It's the hardest. And I applaud those students, but I also say that that's where we all need to be. We're not at a time where it's really wise for us to throw up our hands and say, I can't do anything. It's actually a time for us, and particularly for young people, to get in there and fix it, because that's the only way it'll get fixed. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take your questions. There are microphones in these two aisles. Okay. Hi. Hi. Now that the lights are on, I can see you. You're very attractive people. Yes.
I've been watching you for 20 years.
Oh, well, I'm so glad you didn't say 40.
Well, actually,
Yeah, I know. Her mic's not on, apparently. I could just hear her. The gentleman at are you all on the case back there?
well, I suppose you can hear me.
I know, but they probably are recording it. Here comes some sprightly young person running down to see if the microphone is actually on. Oh, here comes another microphone. Oh, we can hear that one. Okay. Thank you, sir. There you go. Got it.
Anyway, I have admired you really, honestly, because you're so articulate and elitist and poised. I mean, I honestly have admired you for
That's
many
very kind
years.
of you. Thank
And
you.
for a long time, and still I'm not quite certain if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Would you care to answer that question?
I really see both sides. I mean, I always used to say when I covered Congress every day, I don't care what happens, I just want it done by dinner. And and the truth is, that's why it makes me so crazy that people can't hear both sides and can't come together to get things done. Because there's good and bad always in every proposition. And the challenge is to, get to a place where, if you're a legislator, where there's enough good for you that you think it's worth going forward. And you should be able to get to that point if two sensible people sit down and talk together. But
One more question. I know you've addressed the fact that this isn't the first time we've the legislator would have been deadlocked. But personally, I see it and I think we're the best We've got the best system in the world. But I just don't see this Democrat-Republican thing working anymore.
No, it's not working.
It's just not working.
Right. So fix it.
Yes, ma'am, I'll do that immediately.
Over here.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Could you give us possibly the high and the low in your life or professional life?
No. No, because it's, it's also different. Every day, thankfully, is different, and, there are times when you're just working unbelievably hard, and other times when it's not so onerous, but then it's not so interesting. And my professional life includes writing complicated books, and that is incredibly rewarding once they're done. But in the process, this last one, for a whole series of reasons, I was on horrible deadline for, and I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and writing till 6 o'clock at night and Googling heart attack symptoms in women. So, that's a low in one way, but it's a high in another, because you're involved in a challenge that is fascinating and in the end rewarding, but the getting there can be pretty painful.
Well, we appreciate your being here, and come back next year for San Antonio's 300th birthday.
Oh, right, San Antonio's 300. As long as you just don't put me near the pecan, I'll be fine. Go ahead.
Mrs. Roberts, I cannot say that I have been watching you for 40 years, much
Good.
less 20, because I have not been alive for either
Right,
one.
right.
But as an aspiring journalist, do you have any advice for someone like me in these trying times?
Getting in these trying times. Are you doing journalism now?
That my major is communication studies, but I want to be a journalist.
Well, the best thing to do is do it. Go get an internship someplace, or a real job if you can, and with any luck, find a good editor, and just do it. But don't spend all your time here in this wonderful place just doing communications. Learn some history, read some English, write some papers, do some economics, learn some stuff. You've got this fabulous opportunity here that you're not going to have the luxury of once you have to actually go make a living. So take advantage of this great institution while you're here.
I will. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ms. Roberts, I've enjoyed you over decades myself.
Oh, good.
Hey, but I'm only 35. So Ted Turner brought upon the face of the earth the concept of cable news. Back in those days, CNN was, my perspective, a pretty equally balanced network. Over the last 8 to 10 years, however, the major cable networks have gotten quite polarized. And today, I have a concern, I would like to hear your opinion, that certain people are taking over media across the world. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox, of course, and a gazillion other outlets. Does that concern you?
Well, the concentration of media organizations into just a few hands is always concerning. But Rupert Murdoch also owns the Wall Street Journal, which is a first-rate newspaper. So you have to sort of look at each thing on its merits. A bigger concern, frankly, is the economics of the business, and at a time when you have a world where what happens on the streets of Athens can affect your 401k, it is not a time to be cutting back on foreign coverage. And that is what you see in news organization after news organization, with the exception of NPR. And that is because it's very expensive to do. And so that to me is a much bigger concern, is the economics. And the fact that Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post and is essentially treating it like a public trust is a very heartening sign. where he's saying, look, I'm not expecting to make money out of this thing. I'm expecting it to do the job that it's supposed to do as a newspaper. And we need more of that.
Hi, I really enjoyed your speech, and I loved your point about the Washington Post. However, in the age of Trump, with some of the specific anecdotes you had about belief in fact versus untruth, alternative fact, whatever you want to call it, and that there's sort of a false equivalency embedded in these notions, what is the virtue of quote-unquote seeing both sides in the age of Trump?
Well, it is not a virtue for everybody. There are different roles for different people to play. And so to be in a position where you think that the role for you that is the one where you feel most comfortable and can be most effective is to be an activist against Donald Trump, that's a perfectly legitimate decision for you to make. It's not where I am. I am a person that is trying to look at the total picture and see where the facts are and where the problems are, and where the good things are. And so that's a different role. But that doesn't mean that there's not a perfectly good place for different people to be in different roles.
Okay, thank you.
As someone that had the privilege of being drafted or ended up in service, what are your views on bringing back the draft, or at least national service, to give people some skin in the game and, some responsibility in our nation?
So the military is wildly against bringing back the draft, and that counts with me. I mean, they feel strongly that they can do a better job with a volunteer army that they can pick and train. And there have been proposals over the decades to have national service be either mandatory or be so attractive in terms of paying college tuitions, that kind of thing, that pretty much everybody would be doing it. The problems it's run into, and I don't understand why this can't be worked out, but I have to admit that I haven't, gotten into the weeds on it. The problem it's run into in general has been that there are too many people. We have such vast cohorts of 18-year-olds, 21-year-olds, that finding something for every one of them to be doing and organizing all of that has been a challenge that no one has been really willing to take on. At various times, we've done better jobs than others in terms of getting people involved in service. So after 9/11, President Bush really did work on it. And AmeriCorps, which Mrs. Bush really worked very hard on, got many, many more people signed up. And one of the things we know is when people do participate in organizations like, especially AmeriCorps, that it carries over, that they then become more involved in their communities, are more likely to go into the military. All of the kinds of things that we sort of look at as sort of ways of measuring service are truer if someone does go into some form of service like that as a young person. We do know those, we do have that data. But sort of getting everybody into national service has turned out to be daunting, and no one has been able to figure out how to do it. I suppose a bunch of smart people should be able to figure that out, but there are not a lot of young people screaming at them to do it.
Thank you for coming back this evening.
Thank you for being here, Ms. Roberts. In this past presidential election, in the primaries, we had one candidate who had no particular political history or background with his party. He wound up representing his party. On the other side, there was a candidate who was running for president who was not a member of the party, but ran in that party. Do you think that the two-party system is perhaps going to, well, yeah, I was going to say, fracture and become a 3 and 4 party
No,
system?
I really don't. What tends to happen, again, historically, is when we have another movement of some kind, it tends to be regional. And then eventually gets absorbed by one or both of the other parties. I mean, as you well know, being in Texas, that the closest we came to anything outside of the two parties was Perot in 1992, and getting 19% of the vote was, a very healthy percentage, which in a parliamentary system would have, gotten him some seats in Congress and all of that. But we don't have a parliamentary system, thank God. So it is very hard to see how you break up the two parties, but you can influence the two parties mightily. And that's what I've been saying. The way to deal with it is not to say we're going to start something altogether new, but to say, come on, guys, let's fix what we have in a way that voters feel like the parties actually are representing them and hearing them, which is not the way they've been feeling, which is what we saw in this last election, which was, just blow the whole thing up, because we don't like what's going on, and we don't think that anybody that's there is going to fix it. And the notion that you can't get sensible people to fix it is just one that I refuse to accept. You can get sensible people to fix it, but it requires the voters being very engaged. That's what it requires, because otherwise you don't have the momentum to do it.
Thank you.
We'll take one more final question.
Thank you very much for your insights. Speaking of bipartisanship, or more accurately, the lack thereof, I was curious if you had any thoughts on the congressional road trip when last week 2 of the representatives from Texas, one Republican, one
Right.
Democrat, drove to D.C. together, and whether that could possibly be a sign of...
Yes, I do. It was encouraging. I'll take anything. But, yes, that's the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, when families got to know each other. And families just, not whole families. It was bad enough being with your own family, driving for 1,200 miles with no interstates and no air conditioning and the dog. And, but members of Congress, did that all the time. And I think it is very encouraging. And the freshmen, when they went to their orientation, signed something saying that they were going to work together. Now, I haven't heard from them since, but they are freshmen, and they have come into a very puzzling, that's a nice word, situation, and so they're trying to figure it out as they go along. But yes, I was very encouraged by the road trip. So I hope they listen to NPR the whole way up. What a treat to be with all of you. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.